and so are paper tariffs and everything else that comes along with running a newspaper. I want to thank the entire staff from the Palisadian-Post for organizing tonight, especially Gina and Sarah, who work extremely hard every single day to produce an incredible paper for our community. I'd also like to thank Father Kidney and Corpus Christi again for opening up their facilities for us to use. They never say no. And in addition to owning the newspaper, for the last 6 years I've sat on the board of directors of Homeboy Industries, and it's been a real privilege. And I'm going to give a very brief introduction tonight, followed by Father Greg's talk, and then we're going to come up and do a Q&A with questions that have been submitted by readers, questions that I've put together. That's going to be very interesting, so I encourage you to stay. So, as I said, Father Boyle is the founder and executive director of Homeboy, and Homeboy is the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the United States. It's in its 27th year of operation, and the first time I ever heard of Father Greg was watching 60 Minutes with my family. It was a Sunday night in 1992, and Mike Wallace was doing an interview of this priest that seemed a little strange, who was running around on his bicycle in between warring factions of gangs that were shooting at each other. But I also thought, in addition to being incredibly compassionate, I thought he had a brilliant idea, and the idea was to create jobs, to give these gang members a purpose in life, to give them hope. And jobs came with dignity, they came with pride, and they also give you something to get up in the morning for. And so I thought that was brilliant. And more recently, you know, now he's a world-famous star. You see him on TV a lot. You saw him with President Obama and Laura Bush recently giving tours at Homeboy. Incredible commencement speeches. If you want to go on YouTube, the Notre Dame commencement speeches, you'll need a box of tissues with you when he does it. He's written 2 best-selling books, which I strongly encourage everyone in this room to read if you haven't already. And finally, I'll just say that in my life, I've never come across a kinder, more inspiring human being. So please join me in welcoming Father Gregory Boyle.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate that. The chairs are so tempting, but I'll wait, I guess. So it's a privilege to be out here. I feel like I've talked to you guys a lot over the years. Anybody ever hear me speak before? Oh, there you go. Yeah, most of you are lying. So, yeah, so I don't know what I want to say tonight. I'm you know, I was supposed to be here whenever that was. I can't remember when that was, but I got trapped in St. John's, Newfoundland, and I couldn't fly out. So I was there, ended up being there like 48 hours beyond what I wanted to do. So anyway, I'm happy to be here. It's a privilege for 30 years to have worked with gang members and to know thousands of them. And the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than these folks. And people like Lewis, who was just a force of nature and became quite the public speaker, and he loved giving these talks at high schools, and he was much in demand. And anyway, we went out to dinner once, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly, and he said, you know, you've got to pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. And I said, yeah, no shit. Good advice there. So there's a kind of a vision of how we want the world to look in the end, especially in the times in which we live, and we want to imagine a circle of compassion, and then we want to imagine nobody standing outside that circle. There's an idea that's taken root in the world. It's at the root of all that's wrong with it, and the idea would be this, that there just might be lives out there that matter less than other lives. And how do we stand against that idea? How do we dismantle the barriers that exclude, especially in these era of heightened demonizing and tribalism and stuff that is the opposite of who we are. So you go to the margins and you stand there and you hope against hope that the margins will erase because of your decision to stand there. And you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and you stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And you stand with the easily despised, the readily left out. You stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. And you stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. Mother Teresa got it right. She said the problem in the world is that we've forgotten that we belong to each other. And the minute we can restore that notion, all these other things kind of fall into place. And so we choose to create a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. And I suspect that if kinship happened to be our goal, belonging to each other was our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice, we'd be celebrating it. And it's a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. So, we're close enough to the church to maybe to say something about God. I had a spiritual director once who said to me, we need a better God than the one we have. He was a Jesuit, so, but I think he's right. Meister Eckhart, who was a mystic and theologian who died in 1348 or something, said that it's a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. And I think that's quite right, but, we've settled for this kind of puny God, a judgmental, angry, wrathful, whatever God we grew up with. So we end up abandoning that. People will say to me, oh, I've lost my faith. I go, yeah, isn't that what's supposed to happen? You're supposed to lose that sense of this tiny, narrow God, the one created in our own image. And we have to kind of chip away at that. Anne Lamott always says, you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do. And so I think that's kind of important. So you want to, land on some kind of image, Yeah, I buried my mom, a handful of months ago, and she was 92 years old and had 8 kids and a slew of grandkids, and she wasn't one bit afraid of dying, and she was sharp as a tack even to the very end. In the last year, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And but she was kind of oddly exhilarated at the prospect of dying. My dad had died like 25 years ago. And she was kind of excited about it, exhilarated. She says, I've never done this before. It was something you might say before skydiving, but at the end, she would kind of go in and out of consciousness, and she would kind of open her eyes, and she'd lock onto one of her kids, and there'd be 2 of us, or 4 of us, or 8 of us, and she'd lock onto one, and she'd look at you, and with breathless delight, she'd say, you're here. You're here. And after I buried her, I thought, well, I think that's the singular agenda item for our God. The God who says, you're here. And so you receive the tender glance of God, and then you choose to be the tender glance of God in the world. Behold the one beholding you and smiling. I can remember once I was saying Mass at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and it's in a gym kind of like this size, maybe bigger, and there were like 500 gang members in it. And I was sitting in a chair, and I was vested in my Alban stole, and I was listening to the words being proclaimed by the homies, and they'd get up and they read from these little sheets that had English and Spanish, English on one side, Spanish on the other. So I thought, I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to listen to the word being proclaimed. And these little gang members got up and they did the first reading, and then the guy got up to do the responsorial psalm, and there was this overabundance of confidence in his voice, and he got up and he said, "The Lord is exhausted." And I look at the sheet, I said, "What the hell?" And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. And I think if you think about it, the exalted God is in fact a God created in our own image, because there's nobody in this hot place who doesn't want to be exalted. And yet that's not the kind of God we have. We have a God who just looks at us with breathless delight and says, "You're here, you're here." And it exactly exhausts God's self in this whole endeavor. Extensive, spacious, expansive. I mention all that because, I don't know, Homeboy Industries doesn't make any sense beyond that. And somehow you want to be in the world who God is, compassionate, loving, and kind. And Homeboy has evolved a lot over 30 years. You know, I think we began in the beginning by just listening to gang members, and they would tell us, especially we started a school initially, and they would say, if only we had jobs. So right away we're off. We've listened to the gang member, we go get jobs. And so we started a program called Jobs for a Future, kind of the precursor to Homeboy Industries. And we were trying to dispatch gang members to jobs, you know. And then we discovered much later that it kind of didn't work. That an employed gang member might or might not return to prison, and an educated one may or may not go back to prison. But we landed on this absolute total guarantee. A healed gang member or returned citizen or former inmate will not ever go back to prison. And so we've moved from a kind of job-centric to being a trauma-informed community to now we're healing-centered. So every gang member who walks through our doors, and we get about 15,000 folks a year in a county that has 120,000 gang members, 1,100 gangs. But every single one walks in with what you would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening. And you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. And so we create this place where everybody's welcome, where everyone feels a part of something, where everyone belongs. And certainly it's true that community trumps gang, but it's the culture at Homeboy that creates healing. It's a kind of a sanctuary where homies with chronic toxic stress can find rest. And then they become the sanctuary they sought. And then they go home and they present that sanctuary to their kids, and suddenly you've broken a cycle. I had a homie, Jermaine, I just saw him at the office. Now he's a navigator. His early 30s, African American. He was a trainee in our program a long time ago. He had been with us like 4 months, and he came in and he said, "I made a discovery today." So he sat down and he told me that when he was 9, he was sitting in front of the TV, lying on his stomach, real close to the screen, when he could see out of the corner of his eye somebody had entered the room, and he sees that it's his mother. She's standing in a doorway, and her arms are extended, and as he brings focus to bear on her, he sees that she has profoundly and deeply slit her wrists, and blood is coursing onto the floor. And she looks at her 9-year-old boy and she says, "See what you made me do." And the next day he was whisked away from her care and put in foster care. Most telling, and in fact terrible of all, was the fact that his other 2 sibs weren't taken away, only him, underscoring what you would never want to underscore. And so that was when he was 9. At 12, he got jumped into a gang. At 17, he was raised the rest of the way in detention facilities and prisons. And there he is in my office, 30 years old, sobbing. And I said, "Jermaine, what was your discovery today?" And when he could speak, he said, "I discovered today that all these years I had preferred my rage to my shame." And because he had made that discovery for the first time in his life, he was able to forgive his mother for having been mentally ill, and forgive himself for having at one point in his life been a 9-year-old boy. But because that happened, he gained some resilience. He re-identified who he is in the world. He attached. And now he could go out into the world, and the world will throw at him what it will, but this time he won't be toppled by it. Homeboy's been around for a long time, and we've gone through a lot of phases, but I think where we are now is whole and complete. Though we grow, we just finished 2 days of what we call the Global Homeboy Network gathering. So years ago when cities would come to us and say, "Could you airlift Homeboy into Wichita, And we had to decide whether we wanted to do that, whether we wanted to franchise, whether we wanted to become the McDonald's of gang intervention programs with over 5 billion gang members served. And we decided not to do that. We said, well, what if we just offered technical assistance, because we think part of the value at Homeboy is that it was born from below, and so we'll help Wichita start something. So most of the folks start with the social enterprise, and then they add things like we have, like case management, therapy, curriculum. In our case, tattoo removal, and lots of other things. So we just came off of our 5th, what we call the gathering, and we had 350 people from all over the world. We have 146 programs modeled on Homeboy in the United States and 16 outside the country. And we gather every year, and it's just this magical thing, where people are all on the same page, from Sydney to Guatemala, from Honduras to Chicago. And they set up these things all on this model of a community of tenderness. At Homeboy, we think if love is the answer, community is the context. But tenderness is the methodology. Tenderness is the connective tissue that joins us to each other. The praxis of tenderness is the thing that gets people to the truth of who they are, their true selves in loving. And that's important. And you want to imitate the kind of God you believe in. And it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. I was talking to a homie named Gary who works there, and he was telling me that when he was 9, he and his twin brother were sent to live with a grandmother, and he said to me, she was the meanest human being I've ever known. She would strip us down to our underwear, and we'd sit in a narrow hallway every day after school and on the weekends until we ran away after being with her for a year. And she would duct tape our mouths because she said, I hate the sound of your voices. And he starts to cry, and he has 3 young girls himself, and he says, this is why I never shush my girls, because I love the sound of their voices. again, that moment happens in a place where people are able to find some rest from what they've carried. How do we stand in awe at what folks have to carry rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it? And there's an idea that's taken root in the world. It's at the root of all that's wrong with it. And the idea is this, that there just might be lives out there that matter less than other lives. Demonizing is the opposite of God. Whenever it happens, we know that you're in the presence of untruth. And so you want to stand against that. You want to somehow announce a message. What if we were to invest in people rather than incarcerate our way out of our problems? What if we were to be sophisticated about this? To know that kids join gangs because they're stuck in a despair, a lethal absence of hope, and they can't imagine tomorrow. Or kids are so traumatized they don't know how to transform their pain, so they just keep transmitting it. Or kids really suffer mental illness. This is why kids join gangs. And if we knew that, we would infuse hope to kids for whom hope is foreign, and we would help heal people of the damage that's been done to them. And we deliver mental health services in a timely fashion. That's what we would do. I remember there was a homie, we all called him Bandit, and he was, bandit. He was kind of, selling drugs and into his gang, and he lived in Elisa Village housing projects, and I'd see him late at night. I'd be on my bike, and I'd try to say, how about a job, how about a life, and he'd always politely decline. Until one day he walked into my office, and I couldn't believe my eyeballs. I said, wow, I can't believe you're here. And he says what gang members often say, I'm tired of being tired. So I directed him to our job developers, which in those days was the thing we did first. We would dispatch people out. And as luck would have it, they found a job for him, a kind of a warehouse first kind of job, low-paying job. And, cut to like 5 years later, he's running the whole place. He's the supervisor of the entire warehouse. He's married and with 3 kids. And I hadn't heard from him in many years. And one day he, on a Friday, he called me kind of with panic in his voice. And he said, gee, you got to bless my daughter. I said, ¿Qué pasó? Why? What's happening? Is she sick? Is she in the hospital? Oh, no, he says, on Sunday she's going to Humboldt College. My oldest, my Lisa, she's going to college. But she's a little chaparrita, and I don't know, it's so far away. And do you think you could give her a blessing before she goes? I go, are you kidding? I'd be honored. So he said, tomorrow I have a baptism at 1. Why don't you come at 12:30? We'll have a little send-off. And sure enough, Bandit and his wife and the 3 kids show up, and I have them stand in front of the altar, and I said, let's put Lisa in the middle, and let's surround her with our bodies. Everybody touch her, put your hands on her head, on her shoulder. Go ahead and close your eyes and bow your heads. And as the homies say, I do a long-ass prayer. I go on and on. And somewhere in the middle of this thing, I noticed that we've all become chillones. We're all just crying. And I don't know why we're crying exactly, except for the fact that Bandit and his wife don't know anybody who's ever gone to college, except me. Certainly nobody in their families. And so we finished the prayer and we wipe our eyes, and I kind of changed the subject. I look at little tiny Lisa and I say, hey, what are you going to study at Humboldt College? And she was very quick. Forensic psychology. I go, damn, forensic psychology. And Bandit over here chimes in. He said, yeah, she wants to study the criminal mind. Lisa looks over and she does one of these, you know, and everybody laughs. He says, yep, I'm going to be her first subject. So we go out to the car, and big abrazos, everybody piles into the car, but Bandit hangs back, and I'm glad he has. I said, hey, can I tell you something? I give you credit for the man you've chosen to become, for choosing to walk in your own footsteps. I'm proud of you. And his eyes well up with tears, and for a moment he can barely speak, and he says, "Sabes qué? I'm proud of myself. All my life, people called me a lowlife, a bueno para nada, a good for nothing. I guess I showed them." I said, yeah, I guess you did. And the soul feels its worth. Exactly right. Many Buddhist texts begin with this sweet line, "O nobly born, remember who you really are." And I think that's kind of the whole point of Homeboy Industries, is to help folks know the truth of who they are. The principal suffering of the poor is shame and disgrace. How do you dismantle those messages and replace it with the truth? Everyone in this room and outside of it is called to be an enlightened witness, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking folks to measure up. Why would we do it? Especially when our exhausted God doesn't do it. This God who, frankly, loves the sounds of our voices. So instead, we hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth. And their truth is my truth, and my truth is your truth, and your truth is a gang member's truth, and it just happens to be the same truth, and here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. So then you watch folks, especially those on the margins, as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. But you have to reach in, and you constantly have to dismantle, so that people will know this truth. And knowing this truth, no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it really is quite huge. What we invite people to do at Homeboy Industries, volunteers, those who work there, and those who come there as trainees, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of folks, is we invite them into exquisite mutuality, where there is no us and them, there's just us. Otherwise, there's this high moral distance between the service provider and the service recipient, when in fact it's mutual. It's always mutual. You don't go to the margins to rescue anybody. But go figure, if we all go there, we're all going to find rescue. You don't go to the margins to make a difference. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. In the original covenantal relationship, God says, "As I have loved you, so must you have a special preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger." And God thinks these are the folks who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered in exactly this way, God thinks they are trustworthy guides to lead the rest of us to the kinship of God. If I've learned anything over the 30 years, that saving lives is for the Coast Guard. You show up, you look at people with breathless delight every day, and you say, you're here, you're here. And the soul feels its worth. Oh, nobly born. I was interviewed once on the Christian Broadcasting Network, and this woman asked me, so what do you do at Homeboy Industries? So I went on, I did the list, tattoo removal, and 15,000 folks a year, and 18-month training program, and it's about healing and creating a community of tenderness, which causes people to be resilient, that guarantees folks won't return to prison. We have 9 social enterprises. We always keep people engaged in curricular things and their own further education. So we have lots of classes and therapy and case management. And I went on about how we were the largest gang intervention program on the planet, and how 120,000 gang members in LA County, every single one knows where we are, and they know what we do. And we don't exist for those who need help, only for those who want it. But once they walk in, it's a ticker tape parade, and we welcome everybody. I went on like that, till finally the woman looked at me, and she kind of made a face, and she said, yeah, but how much time do you spend each day at Homeboy Industries, praising God? And I didn't know what to say, so I said, all damn day. And I don't think she liked that answer very much. But it begs this question: what kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? I think it's a good question. So I'll end with this story, and I'll invite Alan up to throw questions at me. Oh no, I have one more story. So so I've written a second book now, Barking to the Choir, but when I only had a first book, it would occur to universities to force their students to read my book against their will. So I'm not complaining, but my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, forced the incoming freshmen to read it, and they said, please come up and speak, and we'll have a Tuesday night venue, and there'll be like 1,000 people there. And I said, sure. Can you bring 2 homies with you? And I always do when they're going to pay for it, and I always pick homies the same way. I always pick enemies, rivals among our trainees, just to force them to share a hotel room, just to mess with them, And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. I remember I was at LAX with 2 older vatos, and one guy dead serious said, hey, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, well, yes, it's a requirement, actually. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked 2 homies, Bobby, an African-American gang member, worked in the bakery at the time, and Mario, who at the time worked in our merchandise store where we sell our logo stuff. And I've done this hundreds of times, thousands of times probably, with men and women, and I've never taken anybody on a trip like this more terrified of absolutely panicked, petrified of flying than this guy, Mario. I mean, he was hyperventilating, like that, and we hadn't even boarded the plane yet, So we're at Burbank Airport, and a tiny airport, and big bay windows from Southwest Airlines, and they don't have that hermetically sealed chute, where you board the plane. You have to walk out into the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb up the steps to get to the front of the plane, and the big feature, of course, everybody knows at Burbank, are the steps to go to the back of the plane. And so I'm sitting there with Mario, and Bobby's off somewhere walking around, and And our plane arrives, it's early morning, and they're keep planing, and I said, you know, that's, Mario, that's our plane. And I thought, oh my God, he may die before we actually climb those steps to board the plane. And then I see our flight crew, and I see 2 flight attendants, females, both of them with very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps of the plane to board, and Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? And I said, well, as soon as they sober up the pilots, there they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. But I should tell you that in our 30-year history, I think people would agree that there's no individual more tattooed than Mario. I noticed you had a picture of him earlier on the screen. He's all sleeved out, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered with tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt in your mind that this is the end. And I'd never been in public with him, and so I'm walking with him, and I watch people, and they go like this, and they recoil, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely, and I'm thinking, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were to go tomorrow to Homeboy Industries and ask anybody there, who's the kindest, most gentle soul here, they won't say me. They'll take a half a beat and they'll say Mario. And Mario sells baked goods over the counter in our cafe bakery. He is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. So we get to Spokane and Gonzaga, and this always happens. The big talk Tuesday night. What they don't tell you is that, they have like all 93 other talks all day long, all day Tuesday, and this class, this meeting, this lunch, this meeting, this class, all damn day. And so I tell the two of them, I'm going to sit in the back of the room, and you get up and speak. And so they were terrified, especially Mario, but they do a good job. And they tell stories of torture and terror and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So the nighttime comes, and I can't recall exactly if we had planned to do this or I sprung it on them. I think I sprung it on them because they were just kind of along for the ride, and they had been speaking all day. But I said, I want you guys to get up, do like a little 7-minute thing each, and then so I can include you in the question and answer at the end. And they were terrified, especially Mario was just absolutely beside himself. And they got up and they did a good job. And so then I did my thing, and then I invite them to stand on either side of the podium, and I invite questions. Yes, ma'am. And a woman stands, and yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gates for Mario. And Mario grabs the microphone, and he's this tall, skinny drink of water, and he's just terrified. And yes. She says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? Mario closes his eyes and he clutches the microphone more intently, and I can feel that his emotions are starting to rise, and he's trembling, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to figure out what the hell to say, and when suddenly he blurts out, and as soon as he says those 2 words, he rushes back to his microphone-clutching, closed-eyed refuge. And now I know he's losing his battle with his tears, but he really wants to get this entire sentence out. And tears are rolling down his cheek. And he says, I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. And she looks at Mario and she says, why would you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers returned him to himself. And they were in turn returned to themselves, because it's exquisitely mutual. And everybody in the room is feeling nobly born. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any damn interest in. It is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. And so we go to the margins, not to make a difference, but hope against hope that the widow, orphan, and stranger will make us different. And you stand there and you don't care whether anyone accuses you of wasting your time. The prophet Jeremiah writes, in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Voices different than ours get heard. We choose to be in the world who God is. Compassionate, loving, kind, who loves the sound of our voices, who looks at us and says, with breathless delight, you're here. Thank you very much.
Incredible, as always. Trying to dry my eyes and get refocused. Actually, I'm going to switch it up because the way you ended reminded me of something. You weren't always the hero. You were actually the demon in the early years. There was this priest who's holding the gun while the gang members are pulling the trigger. There was this man wasting his time with these people that should be locked up and thrown away the key. The world has changed a lot. I mean, nobody would dare say anything about you or Homeboy or anyone trying to help that way, at least in the last decade or so. How has that change come about? And I'm sure you played a large role in that.
Yeah, well, I would say I've never been the hero, so, and because I've never had to carry what these folks have had to carry. So, yeah, in the early days, so we're 30 years now, and the first 10 years were bomb threats, hate mail, death threats, and that's because the demonizing was so wholesale, and that was Daryl Gates period, and that was Operation Hammer, wipe them out, and so the friend of our enemy is our enemy. So it was a short hop to demonize me if you were demonizing gang members. So, so that happened. So at the time, you look back on it, and people came along. I think the minute you kind of are in the vicinity of people's humanity, then it changes, The minute you can kind of see, and recognize that we were all born wanting the same things. And, I grew up in the city, but I won all these lotteries, the parent lottery, the mental health lottery, the zip code lottery, the education lottery, the opportunity lottery, just endless lotteries that I won. And then there are folks, who just didn't. I had a homie, Jose, in my office. He's kind of in charge of the trainees, manager of the trainees. And, he said, it's funny, my wife and I, we dropped off our 4-year-old son, Vincent, at school today. I guess it's pre-K or something. And they're walking to the car, and Jose's crying, and his wife says, why are you crying? I mean, he's going to be fine. And he goes, no, that's not it. He said, when I was a kid, we didn't own cups or glasses. We drank out of old pickle jars. We did not know what silverware meant. We would jack ketchup packets from McDonald's and we would call it lunch. And we'd wipe our asses with newspaper. And there's my son, first day of school, clean new clothes and a brand new backpack. That's why I'm crying. And I thought it was so poetic and lyrical and amazing, and the day won't ever come when I will be asked to carry what he's had to carry. So once people get in the vicinity of that nobility, and you know that we were all born wanting the same things, then suddenly there's no room for judgment. And if awe gets a foothold, judgment doesn't stand a chance. And in the Acts of the Apostles, they say, and awe came upon everyone. And the measure really of our health as a community and as a city absolutely resides in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment. And we weren't there 30 years ago, but we've moved there. And so anyone who thinks progress doesn't get made, I would suggest that you look at the city of Los Angeles in the last 30 years, especially in terms of gangs. That we've moved to this better place. We're not completely there, but the arc of the moral universe is getting to where it needs to be.
So let's touch on the lottery victories. I've heard you say many times that Disneyland wasn't the happiest place on earth. Your home on Norton was. And that the two loving parents, the 5 sisters, the 2 brothers, the private Catholic school education, Loyola Marymount, wouldn't have known a gang member if you saw one, wouldn't have come in contact with someone living in absolute poverty. So let's go all the way back. How did you end up choosing this life? How did you decide to become a Jesuit priest and start working with gang members and end up in Bolivia? And take us through that path.
Well, I was educated by Jesuits, so I love the Jesuits, and we had lots of Jesuits at Loyola High, and they possessed 2 things that I loved, and one was they were hilarious, and they were prophetic. So it was at a time when, during the Vietnam War, and it was just kind of crazy. Hey, we're going to drive to San Francisco to the big march. You want to go? And we all pile in a van, And they were just the funniest human beings on the planet, which was another way of saying to me that they knew what joy was. And the poet, William Carlos Williams, says of poetry, if it ain't a pleasure, it ain't a poem. And I think that's true about anybody's life, that the point is joy. And you want to go where the joy is. Or as Jesus says, that, my joy, yours, your joy complete. That's the whole agenda item. And where is the joy? So I've just been joyful as a Jesuit. And then I went to Bolivia, and it kind of turned me inside out, and I felt sort of evangelized by the poor, but it was always joy. And I think people think stuff is a grim duty. And I get more people say to me, my God, I buried 224 kids killed because of gang violence. And people will do this kind of, how do you do it? And, kind of it must be hard kind of thing. And I always think, that's when I feel kind of fraudulent, because I wouldn't trade my life for anybody's. A lot of heartache, but it's always just so anchored in joy and an experience that you're being saved in the present moment, and how we're all just called to delight in the person in front of us. I had a gang member who works with gang members now in Houston kind of plead with me after a talk I gave, and he said, how do you reach them? Meaning gang members. I said, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? So then suddenly it becomes, can you receive people? Can you welcome people? Can you be hospitable to who people are? Can you take delight in just holding up a mirror, and all of a sudden everybody's inhabiting their own dignity and nobility? Wow, it doesn't get better than that. So it's where the joy is, and if it ain't a pleasure, it ain't a poem. And so I think that's the whole point, is you've got to find out where the joy is, and that's what you're called to do. And you shouldn't settle for anything less.
So, if I have this right, and correct me, so you return from Bolivia and you request from the church to be sent to work with the poorest you can find, and you are at the time the youngest the youngest pastor in the history of the diocese. And so you get assigned to Dolores Mission to work with the poor, and immediately realize, hey, I'm in the middle of a gang territory, everybody's shooting each other, I've never seen anything like this. And then what? I mean, what was it that, and why don't you talk about Ray Stark as well and how that evolved?
Well, initially, so I went there in '84, and then I went, the summer of '84, I was just ordained, and then summer of '85, and then I went to Bolivia. I was supposed to go to Santa Clara after that to run those kinds of student immersion programs. And then I got back, and I had been ruined for life by this experience in Bolivia. And so I went to my provincial. I said, please don't send me to Santa Clara. I don't experience it as where the joy is. So I said, send me to the poorest place. And so the poorest place was Dolores Mission, where the pastor had just bailed because it's a hard place. So he left, and he went back to Mexico. So, and he was a Jesuit, and so they said, could you go there? And I thought I was just going to be the fourth guy on the totem pole. Well, I went there and I was pastor, and my Spanish sucked, and so initially there were issues of immigration. That was the main thing for the first 2 years. And then in '88, I buried my first young person killed because of this. And we have a lot of middle school, junior high age gang members who no school wanted, so they were wreaking havoc during the day in the projects, writing on walls. They were violent, selling drugs. So I walked out to them and I said, hey, what if I found a school that would take you? Would you go? And to my surprise, they all said yes. And so I kicked the nuns out of the convent, you know, in a nice way. I gathered them in the living room. There were all these Belgian nuns, about 9 of them. And I said, hey, you know, would you guys mind, you know, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members. And they looked at each other and they said, sure. And that was the extent of their entire discernment process. And then, so then the homies came in large numbers to our property. If only we had jobs, we started Jobs for Our Future. We tried to find felony-friendly employers. Then we couldn't find that many, so we invented crews, maintenance crew, graffiti removal crew, a crew to build the child care center. Then the unrest happened, and our community, the poorest in the city, didn't explode. Every other pocket of poverty did. LA Times wanted to know why. I said, I think it's because we had 60 strategically hired gang members from rival gangs, from our 8 gangs in the projects, working. They had a reason to get up in the morning, and a reason not to torch their own community during this, after the Rodney King verdict. So the LA Times wrote that article. Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million, summoned me to his office. And he said, how should I spend my money? I look back now and I realize how woefully I undershot the request. I said, well, buy this crappy abandoned bakery across the street from the school. And it's got ovens. So I don't know, we could put ear nets on rival gang members and we could call it, I don't know, Homeboy Bakery, and they could bake bread. The extent of my entire business plan. And he said, sure. So he funded it and then helped fund our silk screen factory sometime after that. And not every business was successful. Homeboy Plumbing really was not a huge success. Apparently people didn't want gang members in their homes. So did not see that coming. So that's how we've kind of evolved over the years. And then people started to, this was at a time, you know, when you, Alan, you mentioned earlier about the demonizing and the wholesale, whatever you want to call it, lock them up, throw away the key. And those were in the days when we really, every presidential debate was about who's tougher than whom. Oh, he's soft on crime, well, I'm tough on crime. And then that stopped. People stopped doing that. And it's because people went, well, that's a dumb choice. I don't want to be soft or tough. I'd rather be smart. So then people in the city of LA saw Homeboy Industries as smart. Oh, okay. We're going to save a lot of money. We're going to save a lot of lives. We're going to be safer. And in the end, you know, Homeboy Industries has had a singular impact on public safety in this county. And I think every chief of police has always recognized that, including the sheriff. So we kind of got smart, and then people started to, and that was a kind of a shift where people saw that this was an approach that made more sense than the dichotomized soft or tough.
Okay, so we have rival gang members working together, and you quickly discover there's a lot of magic in a job, a lot of pride. It's sort of the secret sauce of America. You keep people working, and it's a way to get up in the morning and be a part of something. How quickly did you realize these people are more damaged, and it's not just going to be stopping a bullet with a job, which was the most famous saying that everybody still quotes from Homeboy, even though we stopped using it many years ago. How quickly did you realize it, and then how did those services evolve to realize, okay, do we need tattoos? Do we need all the things we have today? How to turn on a computer, yoga, this kind of thing?
Well, it happened with a single person. This happens sometimes. There's a guy who found a job. He was a kind of a gang leader, good guy, and then he found a career, and it was kind of in the movie business, and people loved him, directors, and he sort of worked his way up. And then the monkey wrench was tossed into his life. His lady leaves him, and he ends up going to the neighborhood, to the barrio where he hadn't been. He gets in a car with another guy, and they go to kind of a bar, and the young guy had a gun, and he said, shoot, I have a gun, they're not going to let me in with this gun. And this guy, who I was speaking of, said, give it to me because I know the bouncer, he's not going to pat me down. So they go in, and he drinks a bit. And then it's one of those, why are you looking at my lady thing? And so they start to leave, and 6 guys surround him in the parking lot. His name was Robert. And they get him on the ground, and they're breaking bottles over his head. And he remembers that he has this gun. And he pulls it out, and he kills the guy who's hitting him over the head. And he's doing 125 years to life. And I thought, well, you do an anatomy of that, and you go, he got toppled by that monkey wrench that got thrown into his life. And so the whole point is that if you don't transform your pain, you're just going to keep inflicting it. And you don't want people to unravel. I was talking to a homie today, and he was proud of himself because he had been, all these buttons got pushed. And he said, and I didn't respond. I took a deep breath. I knew the consequences of if I did this, if I kind of just blew up, and I didn't do it. And I was so proud of him, and he was proud of himself. But that was the difference. And then we kind of went, people are caring too much, and unspeakable things were done to them as children. And that has effect if you don't go through it, and there's only one way through it, and that is through it. And they just, a guy texted me yesterday, and he said, I don't deserve kindness. It seemed like the most heartbreaking thing to say. He doesn't work at home, but he wants to, and he's almost there. But I don't deserve kindness. Well, of course you do. Recently I was at Pelican Bay, which is deemed the prison of the worst of the worst. And I went there, and I was being led by the chaplain, a guy named Sam, through the ADSEG, which is a kind of a segregated place and for guys who misbehave, and then the SHU, the security housing unit, for guys who really permanently misbehave. And so I can hear him, he's introducing me as, this is Father Greg, the founder of Homeboy Industries. And so as we're walking through, and so I get to, the next door after he introduces, and the guy comes to the door, a big, huge guy covered in tattoos. And he goes, you're Father Greg? I said, yeah. He goes, huh. I said, what? He goes, well, you look thinner on TV. So I thanked him for mentioning this. So then we go to a gym, and we have 200 inmates there, and so I give a talk. And afterwards, the chaplain has commandeered the warden's camera, and so, he's taking pictures, which is normally prohibited, but the warden gave him permission. So it's 2 homies and 8 homies and 16 homies, and all pictures with me. And there was this one guy named Ernie, who I'd met earlier, kind of a charming, goofy guy, face covered in tattoos. And he told me, I got all day, which means he'll never walk out of that prison alive. I guess he's what they mean when they say worst of the worst. Well, he's photobombing every single picture. He's in every picture, and I'm waiting for the homies to get kind of pissed at him, but every single picture, he's like this, and it's just cracking me up. And so we're leaving to go to another yard, and I'm telling this to the chaplain. So he tells me this story that a couple months before, a concert pianist, a guy who played Carnegie Hall, said, I want to give a concert to the inmates. So the chaplain ducats 200 people. And ducating means you go through the paperwork, you get permission for them to leave their cell to come to. It's a big deal. 200 inmates. Well, only 60 show up. And he's a little disappointed, the chaplain. So the guy gets up, he goes, I'm going to play the piano for like 45 minutes, and then we'll do question and answer. So he plays. And the chaplain, Sam, tells me it's the most gorgeous, incredible, breathtaking music you've ever heard in your life. And it just transports everybody to some other place. And he looks at the inmates. Every single one is sobbing, doubled over. They're weeping, and he can hardly believe it. And then he looks at the guards, and the guards are turning their heads away, and they're flicking tears. Everybody is crying. Then he finishes playing, and they're a mess. They're just weeping. And he says, anybody question? You want to ask me what Carnegie Hall's like or something? Nobody can speak because they're just overwhelmed. And then Ernie, the photobomber, stands, and he's sobbing, and he can barely speak until he can finally eke out one word, and he says, why? And the concert pianist is sobbing because he knows what the question means. And he says, because you deserve beauty. You are worthy. And I am no different than you. And that's what you hope for. That somehow we'll arrive at that place where we know we belong to each other.
For those of you who haven't been down to Homeboy and taken a tour, I strongly encourage it because it's one of those things that can be described, but until you're there. My wife and I sat in on an interview with the intake interviews because it's very hard to choose who gets in the program. There is no cherry picking to get statistics. I mean, they accept the worst of the worst. And a guy comes in, and he's covered in tattoos, and he's giant, and I start asking him questions. Did you graduate high school? No. Did you graduate junior high? No. Do you have a driver's license? No. Do you know your social security number? No. When's the first time you were locked up? 9 years old, juvenile hall camps. Have you ever had a job? No. And you realize this person really has been thrown away into the trash. They don't even exist. They don't even know where to start. And so it seems, the job is great, but until you can, they help get an identification card. They help you get your GED. I mean, it's full wrap around. So the statistics, if I have this right, it's about 70% of people that are incarcerated that are released will end up committing a crime and returning. And the ones that complete the Homeboy training program, the 18-month training program, and take classes and everything, have about a 30% reincarceration rate. And that's almost a misleading statistic because it's way more dramatic than that 30, because you really are taking the murderers, the ones that have committed heinous crimes. You're not taking the guy that stole a piece of pizza and got his, second felony because it happened to be. So can you talk about that how damaged and how you can put them into that program and still hit those incredible numbers?
Well, I think it's the relationship that saves, and so you want to invite people into relational wholeness with each other, and that's really powerful. The homie was describing it the other day. He goes, "There's an aroma to Homeboy. You walk in, and it's tender, and it's safe." The population, homeless and gang member, is very similar in as much as both groups constantly carry backpacks filled with chronic toxic stress. And so what has sort of eluded us is that you can't really deliver what you need or what they need if they're stressed, because they're always watching their back, they don't trust anybody. And so there's that kind of human development pattern that goes trust to self to adventure. So trust is the bond you make with, you know, your caregiver, your mom, your dad, your parental family connection. And you feel that there's kind of trustworthiness in the world, which leads you to your own true self, because then you're confident to be that. And then you can go out in an adventure into the world, and you can navigate all the crises of intimacy and generativity. So that kind of pattern that, you know, happens in healthy kind of attachment hasn't happened. So we're not cherry pickers, we're reverse cherry pickers. You know, if you seem resilient and a really good guy and capable, and we're not going to bring you in. But we want the surly and the difficult and the belligerent. And then we choose not to be tripped up by behavior. Behavior is a language, who cares? Behavior is an indicator. Behavior is telling you something. Behavior is pointing at something. Gang violence itself is about a lethal absence of hope. And it's pointing to that. In the same way, you know, that a cough indicates lung cancer. You know, the cough isn't the issue, but you want to, what's it pointing to? What do we need to address? So in 19th century medical history, you know, they had all these diseases that were quite vexing, and people applied everything they knew to apply, doctors, hospitals, medicine. Nothing worked to alleviate these diseases here. But then quite inadvertently, somebody happened to address the water supply way over here. And then these diseases disappeared because these diseases were about something else. Gang violence is about something else. And it kind of breaks my heart. I look at different places in Chicago, and people will say to themselves in kind of a self-congratulatory way, we are going to address this issue head on, but in fact they don't. They, in any more than the medical folks address the diseases in the 19th century. The violence in Chicago is about something else. Find the something else and address that and watch what happens. But instead, a lot of cities have funded all these kinds of things, you know, these programs that are, think gang violence is about the Middle East or Northern Ireland, and it isn't. It's the urban poor's version of teenage suicide. No kid is seeking anything when he joins a gang. He's fleeing something. So address that. Address what the kid is fleeing. And then you've done something, you know. But and the sign of health in any city. I go to a lot of cities. I'm about to go to 3 cities starting tomorrow, and the sign of health in addressing these kinds of issues is, you know, if it's rarefied, specialized, step aside, let us handle this. If it's exclusive, your response to these things, then that's an unhealthy city. But if it's all hands on deck and don't disqualify yourself, and if you're the proud owner of a pulse, and come on, spacious, expansive, everybody in this room can be a positive presence in the face of such a thing. That's a healthy community.
What's the role of the Vatican or the diocese or the Jesuits with funding, assisting, involvement at all with Homeboy?
Oh, that's easy. None.
How about the government?
3% of our $20 million annual budget.
So where does the rest come from, and how can everyone in this room help?
Well, you know, half of our revenue comes generated from our businesses, you know, our 9 social enterprises, and the rest is, you know, like $10–11 million a year. That's a heavy lift, and as soon as we've raised it, we have to go back and raise it all over again. So I've gotten in trouble for saying this, but I said, if we were a shelter for abandoned puppies, we would have been endowed by now. But because we deal with human beings who are disposable, and I got a lot of anti-puppy people who kind of took me on. Yes, and you just go, wow. I would hope that would be a clear statement, but it does tell us, you know. I was at home at lunch, and it was one of the woman, whatever her name is, Sarah McLachlan or something, singing the plaintive song about, and it's pictures of, heartbreaking pictures of animals behind bars and looking terrible, but on the screen it said things like abandoned, neglected, tortured, beaten, thrown away. And there is not a single human being who's ever sought our services at Homeboy Industries about whom you could not say every single one of those things. So I remember I went back to the office and a worker there, Marissa, I told her about this, and she goes, yeah, but you know, animals are innocent. There is not a single human being who has ever stepped through our doors who wasn't a child who had horrible things done to them. Not one. And everybody in this room and outside of it, all of us were born wanting the same things. Everybody. Sorry.
I'll end with this. If you were the benevolent dictator, and you could be in charge of everything, the prison system,
We already have
policing, we have a very stable genius. We don't have the benevolent dictator. Very stable. You know, what changes if you could just wave a pen? I mean, globally, for this issue.
I don't know. I mean, again, I'm an aerial view guy, and I think the problem is that indeed we've forgotten that we belong to each other. So I don't think there are bad guys in the world. You'd think I would have bumped into one, but I've never met one. Don't believe in evil. I just don't believe in it. I believe in damage. I believe in trauma. I believe in mental illness. The largest mental hospital in the world is LA County Jail. What does that tell us? Half of the 800,000 people imprisoned in this country, half have been diagnosed with a mental illness. Another quarter, they say, are just completely psychologically stressed out of their minds. But that's really, the truth is, all of them are. And, you know, what if we thought that those folks belonged to us? And wouldn't we respond with compassion? But we're stuck in this kind of place, you know, where we like striking the high moral distance between us and them. But it's the opposite of our God. And it really is. And demonizing is the exact polar opposite of the kind of God we have. And people can believe in God or not believe in God. But our concept of God can absolutely alter our culture. Because the minute you want to be this tender glance in the world, it changes absolutely everything. So I'm not a policy wonk, because I know that the minute you've made this shift, you say, you belong to me, and I belong to you, then it's a game changer. And nothing really changes until that happens. So, if you work for kinship, the byproduct of that is peace. The byproduct of that is justice. The byproduct of that is equality. And that's what you have to do. And you have to allow yourself to be reached. I'll end with one story. So there was a kid named Danny who was one of those kids who got in so much trouble and young knucklehead and putting in work for his gang, as they say. And he vowed to me once when I met him when he was a little kid riding his bike with a gun. He said, I promise to you I will never step foot in Homeboy Industries. So I met him all along the way in the streets mainly, never at our office, but then in jail and juvenile hall, probation camp. Finally, he went to youth authority, and then he ended up going to prison just for 2 years. He was 18, he got out at 20. And in recovery, gang recovery, it takes what it takes. It can be the death of a friend, the birth of a son, a long stretch in prison. For Danny, he got out, and his mother had 6 months to live. She was dying of pancreatic cancer. He had a large family, but he became the hospice caregiver. All the more remarkable because this woman actually tortured this kid. And yet there he was, so tender, and I watched him by her bedside. And then she died. A week later, I buried her. And a week after that, he steps foot into Homeboy Industries for the first time. And I watch him inhabit the truth of who he is. I watch him complete his GED and start to take classes at East LA College, community college. I watch him throw his arm around guys I know he used to shoot at because I remember, and laughing with them. And so one day he comes into my office and he begins by saying, what happened to me yesterday has never happened to me in my life. And he tells me that he was on the Gold Line right across the street from Homeboy, the Chinatown stop, heading east to go home, a packed train, but he gets a seat. Standing in front of him, hanging onto a pole, he says, is a medio bedo guy, a guy who's a little bit drunk. He knows he's a homie because he can see tattoos on his hand, but older guy doesn't know who he is. And Danny is wearing a sweatshirt that fills his whole chest, and it says, jobs not jails, Homeboy Industries. So the little bit drunk guy sees the sweatshirt and he goes, hey, you work there. And Danny doesn't know whether he should engage this guy exactly, but he just nods. Is it any good? And Danny shrugs and he says, it's helped me. In fact, I'm never going to go back to prison because of this place. So he stands and he fishes out of his pocket a piece of paper and a pen, and he begins to write the address of Homeboy Industries on this piece of paper. And as he's telling me this story, he says, I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart. So he hands it to the guy and he says, come see us. We'll help you. And the guy studies the piece of paper and he looks at Danny and he says, thank you. And the train stops. And the guy gets off. And Danny sits. And then he starts to buckle under the weight of this. And he can barely speak, but he returns to his earlier refrain. What happened to me next has never happened to me in my life. Everyone on the train was staring at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And now he can barely speak. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. And the two of us, we just wept. Because I'm not sure what you're supposed to do except weep. And suddenly both of us inhabit the truth that we're both nobly born. And sometimes we need to remind each other. Thank you very much.